Before the fall, the world was electric. We were the roaring 20s, a nation high on jazz, illegal gin, and the seductive promise of the stock market ticker. Men were building empires in the sky, the Chrysler Building, the Empire State, and ordinary people believed they could touch the clouds too. They called it the New Era, a time of permanent prosperity. Then, in one catastrophic week in October 1929, the floor didn't just crack, it vanished. This isn't a story about stock charts and politicians. It is the story of the pavement, the dust, and the desperation that followed. It is the story of what happens when a nation's confidence evaporates, leaving behind millions of ordinary people to face a decade of ruin. These are the real stories of the Great Depression. The crash, the view from the ledge. Arthur Vance was not a wolf of Wall Street. He was a mid-level manager at a trusted New York trust company. He wore a gray flannel suit, owned a modest brownstone in Brooklyn, and believed implicitly in the mathematics of American growth. On the morning of October 24th, Black Thursday, that mathematics failed. The sound of the trading floor was the first thing to change. The usual roar of commerce became a shriek, a collective guttural sound of panic. Men in bespoke suits were weeping openly, tearing at their collars. Ticker tape, once a symbol of wealth, piled around their ankles like worthless snow. "It can't be," his colleague whispered, watching the Dow Jones ticker. "It's just a correction." But it wasn't. By Black Tuesday, October 29th, the correction had become a free fall. The market lost the equivalent of twice the entire federal budget. It was an extinction-level event for wealth. Arthur went home that night, a poor man. But the true horror hadn't yet begun. The stock market crash was merely the trigger. The gun was the fragile, unregulated banking system. In the following months, Arthur watched as his own bank, unable to cover its losses, padlocked its doors. The people who arrived weren't wealthy investors. They were waitresses, factory workers, and merchants. They were people who had trusted their life savings, their $500, their $1,000, to his institution. They stood outside the locked brass doors, their faces pressed against the glass, pleading. Arthur stopped taking the main street to work, ashamed to be seen. Within 6 months, he had lost his job. Within a year, he had sold the brownstone. He was the new poor, but he was about to meet the old poor and the desperate poor. He soon found himself standing in a line that stretched 3 blocks, his expensive, worn-out leather shoes soaking through in the rain. He was waiting for a cup of watery soup and a piece of stale bread from a charity kitchen. He never made eye contact. The shame, he would later tell his grandchildren, was worse than the hunger. This was the city. But hundreds of miles away, the very earth was about to turn against the people. The black blizzards, when the sky fell. In the panhandle of Oklahoma, the Miller family didn't own stocks. They owned 160 acres of wheat, and they were, by all accounts, successful. The 1920s had been good. The war had driven up wheat prices, and new mechanized farming, the tractor, had allowed them to plow up every inch of the ancient prairie grass that held the topsoil in place. They, too, believed in permanent prosperity. The crash in New York was a distant rumor. Their problem wasn't the market, it was the sky. It started in 1931. The rain just stopped. The vibrant wheat fields turned a brittle, sickly yellow, then a dead gray. The relentless sun baked the newly plowed topsoil, which had no deep grass roots to hold it in place, into a fine, light powder. Then the wind came. Eliza Miller, the matriarch, was hanging laundry when she saw it. It was not a storm. It was a thing, a solid wall of black, 1,000 feet high, moving faster than a train. They called it
a black blizzard. "Get inside!" she screamed at her two young sons. "Get the rags!" They sprinted for the small farmhouse, slamming the door just as the world went completely dark. It was 2 o'clock in the afternoon, but it was as black as midnight. A low, terrifying moan filled the air as the fine pulverized dust, charged with static electricity, forced its way through every crack in the house, through the window frames, under the door, through the keyhole. They huddled in the kitchen, tying wet rags over their faces so they could breathe. The dust didn't just settle, it seeped. It got into the water pail, into the flour bin, into their teeth. When the storm finally passed, 6 hours later, they emerged into an alien landscape. The tractor was buried. Their mule was dead, its lungs packed solid with mud. A fine layer of dust, like a funeral shroud, covered everything inside the house. This was not a one-time event. This was the Dust Bowl. For years, these storms scoured the plains, stripping the land down to the hard pan. Children and the elderly began dying of a new, horrifying ailment called dust pneumonia. The final blow came from Arthur Vance's world. The bank in town, its own investments wiped out by the crash in the East, had no choice but to call in its loans. The millers, with no crop to sell, couldn't pay. In 1934, the bank foreclosed. They were given 48 hours to vacate. They sold what little they could, the furniture, the tools, for pennies on the dollar. They piled their mattresses, a few pots, their 2 children, and their grandmother onto a collapsing, overloaded Ford Model T. They had $18 and a hand-painted sign on the back of the car, "California or Bust." They were Okies, and they were about to join a river of refugees flowing west on Route 66, heading for a paradise that no longer existed. The road. Refugees in their own country. The journey west was its own special kind of hell. The millers joined a caravan of desperation. Cars looking like grotesque mechanical insects crawled along the 2-lane highway, overloaded with chairs, trunks, and solemn faces. When a tire blew, which it did often, it was a financial catastrophe. When the engine block cracked, it meant the end. They saw families simply abandoned on the side of the road, sitting on their worldly possessions, waiting for a miracle that would not come. They were met not with sympathy, but with suspicion and hatred. In towns along the way, they were dirty Okies, locusts. They were forbidden from using local bathrooms. Gas station owners would take their precious money and then tell them to move along. The most astonishing shock came at the border of California. They believed they were still in the United States of America. They were wrong. The Los Angeles Police Department, LAPD, in an act of dubious legality, had formed what the papers called the Bum Blockade. Over 100 officers were stationed at the state lines, physically turning away cars that looked indigent. They were stopping American citizens and denying them entry based on their poverty. The millers were lucky. They slipped through at night, their headlights off, coasting down a hill. But the paradise they found was just another kind of prison. They landed in a Hooverville, a shanty town in the scrubland outside Bakersfield. Their new home was a collection of cardboard, scrap tin, and discarded lumber. There was no running water, only a ditch. There was no sanitation, and there was no work. Or rather, there was work, but there were 1,000 men for every one job. Signs posted outside the lush orchards read, "No jobs, no hired hands." The lucky ones, like the miller's patriarch, Tom, got to be day laborers. He would stand with a crowd of men at 4 a.m. waiting for a truck. A foreman would arrive and say, "I need 10 men, 20 cents an hour." A desperate scramble would ensue. 20 cents an hour to pick peaches in 100-degree heat. If he was lucky, he'd make $1.50 for a full day's work. It was enough to buy beans and flour. It was never enough to get ahead.
The drifters, riding the rails. While families like the Millers struggled to stay together, a new, nomadic tribe emerged, the Hobo. They were mostly young men and teenagers, cast out from their homes either to ease the burden on their families or simply to search for a life that wasn't starvation. Slim was 17 when he left his home in Ohio. He wasn't running away. He was, as they said, on the tramp. His world was the railroad. He learned the complex art of riding the rails. This was incredibly dangerous. It meant running alongside a moving freight train, grabbing a steel ladder, and hauling himself up into an open boxcar, or even more dangerously, clinging to the iron rods underneath the car. A single slip meant certain death. The greatest threat wasn't the fall. It was the bulls, the railroad police. They were notoriously violent, known for beating transients and throwing them from moving trains. Slim became part of a hidden culture. The Hobo Jungle, a makeshift camp near the rail yards, was their community. They shared a code of ethics. They developed a secret language of symbols. A simple drawing of a cat meant, "A kind lady lives here." A cross meant, "Talk religion, get food." And a series of horizontal lines meant, "Danger, stay away." They were in constant motion, chasing rumors of work, a harvest in Washington, a dam being built in Nevada. But mostly, they were just moving, believing that motion was better than the stagnation of home. At one point, it was estimated that over 250,000 teenagers were living this life on the rails, a ghost army of displaced youth. The government's response, from failure to action. Back in the cities, the crisis had deepened beyond comprehension. By 1932, nearly 1 in every 4 American workers had no job. The government, under President Herbert Hoover, seemed paralyzed. Hoover, who believed in rugged individualism, insisted that private charity, the soup kitchens and the breadlines, was the answer. It wasn't. In the summer of 1932, the ultimate symbol of the government's failure unfolded. Over 20,000 veterans of World War I, men who had fought in France, marched on Washington, D.C. They were the bonus army. They were demanding an early payment of a bonus promised to them for their service, not due until 1945. They were broke, and their families were starving.
They set up a massive, organized Hooverville near the Capitol. The government's response was horrifying. Fearing insurrection, President Hoover ordered the U.S. Army to disperse them. Led by General Douglas MacArthur with his aide Dwight D. Eisenhower, the soldiers advanced with tanks, bayonets fixed, and tear gas. They burned the veterans' shacks to the ground. The image of American soldiers attacking American veterans shocked the nation. It was the lowest point. The election of Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1933 signaled a profound shift. "The only thing we have to fear," he said, "is fear itself." Roosevelt's New Deal was a desperate experiment. It wasn't about rugged individualism, it was about survival. For Arthur Vance, the ruined banker, it came in the form of the WPA, the Works Progress Administration. He was handed a shovel. His first job for $19 a month was helping to build a public park. The former banker, now digging ditches alongside former plumbers and factory workers, felt something he hadn't felt in years, the dignity of a paycheck. For the Miller family, it was the Resettlement Administration, which built clean camps for migrants, offering basic sanitation and a place to live without fear of being burned out by angry locals. For Slim, the Hobo, it was the Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC. He was taken off the rails, put in a uniform, and sent to Yellowstone National Park. He was paid $30 a month, 25 of which was automatically sent home to his family. He spent 2 years planting trees, fighting forest fires, and building trails. For the first time in his life, He had 3 full meals a day and a sense of purpose. The scar that never healed. The New Deal programs provided a floor. They saved lives, but they did not end the Great Depression. It is the stark, astonishing truth that what truly ended the decade of suffering was not a government program, but another, more terrible global catastrophe: World War II. The bombing of Pearl Harbor in 1941 lit a fire under American industry that the New Deal never could. The same factories that had sat silent were now running 24 hours a day building bombers, tanks, and ships. The arsenal of democracy demanded workers. Tom Miller left the migrant camps to work in the shipyards of Oakland. Slim, now hardened and disciplined from the CCC, enlisted in the army and was sent to Europe. Arthur Vance, too old to fight, found work as an accountant for a munitions manufacturer. By 1944, unemployment in the United States was 1.2%. The Depression was, economically, over. But the people who lived through it were never the same. They were a generation scarred by insecurity, forever changed by the memory of hunger and loss. They became the generation that never threw away a piece of string, that obsessively cleaned their plates, that mistrusted banks and easy credit. The Great Depression was not just an economic event. It was a psychological one. It proved that the new era of permanent prosperity was a dangerous illusion. It showed that the floor could indeed vanish. The stories of survival, the shame of the breadline, the terror of the black blizzard, the grit of the hobo jungle, the quiet dignity of a WPA job are more than just history. They are a testament to the fact that when the system collapses, all you have left is your own astonishing, stubborn resilience. They were the generation that fell the farthest and stood back up, forever looking over their shoulder to build the most prosperous nation the world had ever seen. And they never, ever forgot the price.